Welcome to One Book, One Coffee. Today, you're diving into a world of profound ethical exploration, and by choosing this book, you're setting yourself apart from the crowd. You're here, investing your time in understanding the intricate fabric of ethical philosophy, while others might be caught in the endless scroll of social media or a binge-worthy series. And that speaks volumes about you, your desire to learn, to grow, to question the world and your place in it. Today, we're exploring Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill, a cornerstone of philosophical thought that delves into the essence of human happiness and the moral compass that guides our actions. This book is extraordinary for its timeless exploration of utilitarian principles, a subject that remains as relevant today as it was in Mill's time. Though I couldn't find specific endorsements from modern public figures, the book's influence is pervasive in philosophical and ethical discussions globally. John Stuart Mill, a leading thinker of the 19th century, was driven by his commitment to social reform and intellectual enlightenment. Born in 1806, Mill was rigorously educated by his father, James Mill, and the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who laid the early groundwork for utilitarian thought. Mill's personal struggles with mental health and his devotion to his beloved wife, Harriet Taylor, significantly shaped his writing and perspectives. Now, a quick note before we dive in. This is a detailed chapter-by-chapter walkthrough, so it's going to be a longer session. Take your time with it. There's no rush. If you need to step away, save this video to your watch later or forward the link to yourself on WhatsApp so you can pick up right where you left off. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's walk through this book together, chapter by chapter, idea by idea. Let's begin. Exploring the nature of happiness. John Stuart Mill was an influential philosopher driven by a commitment to social reform, shaped by rigorous education, personal struggles with mental health, and a profound relationship with his wife, Harriet Taylor. Picture yourself sitting across from a friend at your favorite coffee shop, steam rising from your mugs as you dive into one of those conversations that makes you completely lose track of time. That's exactly the kind of intimate, searching discussion John Stuart Mill invites us into when he opens his groundbreaking work on utilitarianism. But instead of debating whether pineapple belongs on pizza or which streaming service reigns supreme, Mill wants to tackle something far more fundamental. How do we actually decide what's right and wrong? Now think about this for a moment. Every single day, you make dozens of moral choices without even realizing it. Do you hold the elevator for someone running to catch it, even though you're already late? Do you tell your friend the truth about their questionable haircut, or do you spare their feelings? Do you buy the fair trade coffee that costs a bit more or grab the cheaper option? These might seem like small decisions, but Mill would argue that each one reflects your underlying moral philosophy, whether you've consciously thought about it or not. Mill begins his exploration by acknowledging something that might surprise you. Despite thousands of years of human civilization, despite all our philosophical traditions and religious teachings, we still don't have a universally accepted answer to the most basic ethical question. What makes an action right or wrong? It's like we've been having this massive, ongoing argument for millennia, and we're still nowhere near consensus. Think about how we can send messages instantly across the globe, perform heart surgery with robotic precision, and predict the weather days in advance, yet we still struggle with questions that a child might ask. Why is stealing wrong? Or when is it okay to lie? This isn't because philosophers have been lazy or because the questions are unanswerable. Rather, Mill suggests, it's because we've been approaching the problem in the wrong way. Imagine trying to navigate a city without a map or GPS. You might eventually reach your destination through trial and error, but wouldn't it be better to have some reliable guidance system? That's essentially what Mill believes moral philosophy has been missing, a clear, practical principle that can guide our decisions. Enter utilitarianism, though Mill doesn't immediately reveal all its secrets. Instead, He sets the stage by pointing out something fascinating about human nature. When people argue about right and wrong, they almost always appeal to consequences. Even when someone claims to follow absolute moral rules, scratch beneath the surface, and you'll find them justifying those rules based on their outcomes. The person who says lying is always wrong will usually explain that lying destroys trust, hurts relationships, and creates a worse world for everyone. The person who believes in keeping promises will point out that a society where promises meant nothing would collapse into chaos. This observation leads Mill to a crucial insight that feels remarkably modern. Think about how we evaluate policies today. Whether we're debating healthcare reform, climate change initiatives, or education funding, what do we ultimately care about? The results. We want to know, will this make people's lives better or worse? Will it reduce suffering or increase flourishing? Will it create more opportunities or fewer? Mill recognized that this consequentialist thinking isn't just how we approach politics. It's how we naturally approach ethics. But here's where things get interesting, and where Mill's genius really shines through. He realizes that simply saying consequences matter isn't enough. After all, consequences for whom? And what kinds of consequences should we prioritize? If you had to choose between a policy that makes a small number of people extremely happy and one that makes a large number of people slightly happier, which would you pick? These aren't abstract philosophical puzzles. They're the kinds of trade-offs we face constantly, both as individuals and as a society. Mill also recognizes that people have legitimate concerns about any moral system that focuses primarily on outcomes. Doesn't this approach risk turning us into calculating machines, coldly weighing costs and benefits without regard for human dignity or individual rights? What about justice, fairness, and those moral intuitions that seem to transcend simple calculations of pleasure and pain? These aren't strawman objections that Mill dismisses. They're serious challenges that he takes on directly throughout his work. Consider how relevant these concerns feel today. We live in an age of big data and algorithmic decision-making, where companies and governments increasingly use utilitarian-style calculations to shape our lives. Your social media feed is curated to maximize engagement. City planners use cost-benefit analyses to decide where to build schools and hospitals, and insurance companies assess risk to determine your premiums. In many ways, we're living in a more explicitly utilitarian world than Mill could have imagined. Yet we still grapple with the same fundamental questions. How do we balance efficiency with fairness? How do we ensure that the greatest good doesn't come at the expense of the most vulnerable? What makes Mill's approach so compelling is his recognition that moral philosophy shouldn't be an ivory tower exercise. It should be practical, applicable, and capable of helping real people make real decisions in an imperfect world. He's not interested in constructing elaborate theoretical systems that sound impressive, but offer little guidance for actual moral dilemmas. Instead, he wants to develop a framework that a parent can use when teaching their children about right and wrong, that a voter can apply when choosing between candidates, that a business leader can employ when weighing the interests of shareholders against those of employees and customers. As we embark on this journey through Mill's utilitarian philosophy, we're not just exploring an abstract intellectual exercise. We're examining a way of thinking that has shaped everything from modern democracy to international human rights law, from business ethics to environmental policy. The questions Mill raises and the solutions he proposes continue to influence how we think about justice, equality, and the good life. So settle in with your coffee and prepare to discover how a 19th century philosopher's insights might just change the way you see the world, one moral decision at a time. Picture yourself sitting in your favorite coffee shop, steam rising from your mug, and a friend across from you poses this question. How do we actually decide what's right and wrong? It's the kind of conversation that can stretch for hours, isn't it? Well, John Stuart Mill had been wrestling with this exact question when he penned his groundbreaking work on utilitarianism in 1863, and what he discovered might just change how you think about every moral decision you make. Mill begins by cutting straight to the heart of the matter. He's frustrated, you see, because after thousands of years of moral philosophy, we still don't have a clear, practical way to determine right from wrong. Think about it for a moment. When you're facing a tough ethical choice, what do you rely on? Your gut feeling, religious teachings, what your parents taught you. Mill argues that while these might feel satisfying, they're often inconsistent and sometimes lead us astray. So he proposes something beautifully simple yet revolutionary: the principle of utility. At its core, this principle suggests that actions are right when they promote happiness and wrong when they produce the opposite. But here's where it gets interesting, and where Mill's genius really shines through. He's not talking about just your happiness or my happiness. He's talking about the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Imagine you're the manager of a small company, and you have to decide whether to give everyone a modest raise or give one person a substantial promotion. A utilitarian approach would have you consider not just the immediate effects, but the ripple effects on morale, productivity, fairness, and the overall well-being of your entire team. It's like being asked to think beyond your immediate circle and consider the broader impact of your choices. Now you might be thinking, this sounds nice in theory, but how do we actually measure happiness? Mill anticipated this objection brilliantly. He acknowledges that happiness isn't like measuring ingredients for a recipe where you can simply add 2 cups of joy and a tablespoon of contentment. Instead, he argues that we need to consider both the quantity and quality of pleasures and pains. Here's where Mill makes a fascinating distinction that sets him apart from earlier philosophers. He argues that not all pleasures are created equal. The satisfaction you get from binge-watching your favorite show might be genuine pleasure, but it's qualitatively different from the deep fulfillment you feel when you help a friend through a difficult time or master a challenging skill. Mill famously declared that it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Think about your own life for a moment. Haven't you experienced this difference? The quick dopamine hit from scrolling social media versus the lasting satisfaction from completing a meaningful project. Mill is essentially saying that when we're making moral calculations, we need to weigh these different types of happiness accordingly. But Mill goes even deeper. He addresses one of the most common criticisms of utilitarianism, that it's too demanding. Critics argue that if we're supposed to maximize happiness for everyone, then we should be constantly sacrificing our own well-being for others. Should you donate every spare dollar to charity? Should you spend every free moment volunteering? Mill's response is refreshingly practical. He suggests that the principle of utility is meant to guide our actions, not consume our every thought. Consider this modern parallel. When you're deciding whether to buy fair trade coffee, you're essentially doing a utilitarian calculation. You're weighing the slightly higher cost to you against the improved conditions for farmers thousands of miles away. You don't need to agonize over every purchase, but being mindful of these broader impacts aligns with utilitarian thinking. Mill also tackles the objection that utilitarianism is godless or immoral, because it doesn't rely on divine command or absolute moral rules. His elegant response: if God is benevolent, then God would want us to promote human happiness and reduce suffering. The principle of utility, rather than contradicting religious morality, actually provides a rational foundation for it. What makes Mill's approach particularly compelling is how it handles moral conflicts that traditional rule-based systems struggle with. Take the classic dilemma: should you lie to protect someone's feelings? A rigid rule against lying says no, but Mill's utilitarian calculus would have you consider the consequences. If a small, harmless lie prevents significant pain without causing greater harm, the utilitarian choice becomes clear. This flexibility extends to larger social issues too. When we debate policies around healthcare, education, or criminal justice, we're essentially asking utilitarian questions. What approach will create the most well-being for the most people? Mill's framework gives us a systematic way to think through these complex issues rather than relying solely on tradition, ideology, or emotion. Now, Mill isn't naive about the challenges his system presents. He acknowledges that calculating consequences can be difficult and that we often have to make decisions with incomplete information. But he argues this is better than having no systematic approach at all. It's like having a GPS that occasionally needs recalibrating versus wandering without any navigation tool whatsoever. What's remarkable about Mill's vision is how it empowers ordinary people to engage in moral reasoning. You don't need to be a philosopher or theologian to apply utilitarian principles. You just need to genuinely care about human well-being and be willing to think beyond your immediate self-interest. As we wrap up our exploration of what utilitarianism actually is, consider how this principle might shift your perspective on daily decisions. From choosing how to spend your weekend to voting on local initiatives, Mill's framework offers a lens for considering not just what feels good or what you've always done, but what genuinely contributes to human flourishing. The beauty of Mill's approach lies in its combination of idealistic vision and practical wisdom. He's asking us to be both dreamers and pragmatists, to envision a world where human happiness matters above all else, while remaining grounded in the reality of how we actually make decisions. And perhaps, over your next cup of coffee, you'll find yourself naturally applying these principles to the choices before you. Picture this. You're standing in line at your favorite coffee shop, and the person ahead of you is fumbling for change while a long queue builds behind them. Do you offer to pay their bill? Mill would say the answer depends entirely on one simple question. Will your action create more happiness in the world than sadness? Welcome back to our journey through John Stuart Mill's revolutionary thinking, where we're diving deep into what he called the greatest happiness principle, the beating heart of utilitarian philosophy. Now think about this for a moment. How do you typically decide what's right and wrong? Maybe you follow religious teachings, or perhaps you trust your gut instinct, or you might apply some universal rule like treat others as you'd want to be treated. Mill had a different idea altogether, one that was both elegantly simple and surprisingly complex. He argued that the rightness or wrongness of any action comes down to a single calculation. Does it produce the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people? Mill called this the principle of utility, but don't let that dry term fool you. What he was proposing was nothing short of revolutionary for his time. Instead of following rigid moral rules handed down by authority figures, or trusting in abstract principles that might sound good in theory but fall apart in practice, Mill suggested we become moral mathematicians. Every decision becomes a happiness equation where we weigh the joy we might create against the suffering we might cause. But here's where it gets fascinating, and where Mill shows his genius. He wasn't talking about some shallow, fleeting pleasure like the sugar rush you get from that third donut. Mill distinguished between what he called higher and lower pleasures, arguing that some forms of happiness are simply more valuable than others. Think of it this way. The satisfaction you feel after helping a friend through a difficult time carries more moral weight than the temporary buzz from binge-watching your favorite show. As Mill famously put it, it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Consider how this plays out in our modern world. When tech companies design social media platforms, they're essentially making utilitarian calculations, though they might not realize it. Should they prioritize features that maximize user engagement, even if those features might contribute to anxiety or depression? Or should they focus on tools that genuinely enhance human connection and well-being? Mill's framework gives us a way to think through these dilemmas by asking not just what makes people happy in the moment, but what contributes to genuine human flourishing over time. The beauty of Mill's approach lies in its democratic spirit. Rather than relying on the wisdom of kings or priests or philosophers to tell us what's right, utilitarianism puts moral authority in the hands of everyone affected by an action. It's like turning ethics into a conversation rather than a lecture. When a city council debates whether to build a new park or expand parking, Mill would have them consider not just the immediate costs and benefits, but the broader impact on community happiness, mental health, environmental well-being, and social connection. But let's be honest about the challenges here, because Mill certainly was. How exactly do you measure happiness? Is my joy worth the same as yours? What about people who aren't even born yet? Should their potential happiness factor into our calculations today? Mill acknowledged these complications while maintaining that the difficulty of moral calculation doesn't invalidate the principle itself. After all, we make complex decisions based on incomplete information all the time. The key is to approach these choices with what Mill called an educated conscience, informed by experience, empathy, and careful consideration of consequences. Think about a parent deciding how to discipline their child. A strict rule-based approach might say lying is always wrong and must always be punished the same way. But Mill's utilitarian parent would consider the specific circumstances. Why did the child lie? What lesson would different responses teach? How would various punishments affect not just this child but siblings and the family dynamic as a whole? The goal isn't to follow a predetermined script, but to choose the response most likely to promote genuine well-being for everyone involved. This principle becomes even more powerful when we apply it to larger social questions. Consider the ongoing debates about healthcare, education, or climate policy. Mill's framework doesn't give us easy answers, but it does give us a clear way to frame the questions. Instead of getting lost in abstract arguments about rights or duties, we can ask, which policies will actually make people's lives better? Which approaches will reduce suffering and increase flourishing, not just for the wealthy or powerful, but for everyone affected by these decisions? What makes Mill's vision particularly compelling is how it handles the tension between individual desires and collective good. Unlike some philosophical systems that sacrifice the individual for the group or vice versa, utilitarianism recognizes that true happiness often comes from being part of a thriving community. Your well-being and mine aren't separate calculations, but interconnected elements of a larger equation. When I help you flourish, I'm not diminishing my own chances for happiness, but contributing to the kind of world where everyone, including me, has a better shot at the good life. As we wrap up our exploration of the greatest happiness principle, notice how Mill has given us something remarkable, a moral philosophy that's both practical and idealistic, both scientific and deeply human. It doesn't promise easy answers, but it offers a framework for thinking through life's most challenging questions with compassion, intelligence, and hope. In our next conversation, we'll explore how Mill refined these ideas to address some of the most persistent criticisms of utilitarian thinking, showing us how this 19th-century philosopher's insights remain startlingly relevant for navigating our complex modern world. Until then, pour yourself another cup of coffee and consider, what would change if you approached just one decision today through the lens of the greatest happiness principle? So here we are, settling into what might be the most crucial part of our journey through Mill's utilitarianism, and I have to tell you, this is where things get really interesting. You know how sometimes when you're explaining your favorite movie to a friend, they immediately jump in with all the reasons why it's terrible before they've even watched it? Well, that's exactly what happened to utilitarianism from the moment Mill put pen to paper. Everyone had an opinion, and most of those opinions were based on some pretty fundamental misunderstandings. Mill knew this was coming, of course. He wasn't naive about human nature or the way new ideas get received in the world. So he did something brilliant. He decided to tackle the criticisms head-on, like a patient teacher sitting down with a room full of skeptical students, coffee in hand, ready to clear the air once and for all. The first major criticism that Mill addresses is probably one you've heard yourself, maybe even thought yourself. People said, "Hold on a minute, Mill. You're basically telling us to be pleasure-seeking hedonists. You want us all to become these shallow, self-indulgent creatures who only care about feeling good." Now, think about this for a moment. When someone today talks about maximizing happiness, what's the first image that pops into your head? Maybe someone binge-watching Netflix while eating ice cream, or someone constantly chasing the next dopamine hit on social media. But here's where Mill gets really clever. He explains that this criticism reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what pleasure actually means in the utilitarian framework. It's like confusing a gourmet meal prepared by a master chef with grabbing fast food from a drive-thru. Yes, they're both food, and yes, they both might give you some immediate satisfaction, but the quality, the depth, the lasting impact, these are completely different experiences. Mill introduces us to what might be his most famous insight, the distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Picture this. You're at a party, and there are two groups of people. One group is engaged in deep, meaningful conversation about art, philosophy, and the mysteries of human existence. The other group is playing drinking games. Both groups are experiencing pleasure, but Mill would argue that the quality of these pleasures is fundamentally different. The person capable of appreciating poetry, music, and intellectual discourse has access to a richer, more fulfilling kind of happiness than someone whose pleasures are purely physical or immediate. But here's what's really fascinating about Mill's argument. He's not being an elitist snob about this. He's not saying that intellectual pleasures are better because they're more sophisticated or because smart people prefer them. He's making an empirical claim based on human experience. He argues that anyone who has genuinely experienced both types of pleasures would choose the higher ones, even if they come with more complexity or even some pain attached. Think about it this way. Would you rather be a satisfied fool or a dissatisfied Socrates? Mill famously suggests that it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. This isn't about intellectual snobbery, it's about the depth and richness of human experience. Now, another criticism that Mill tackles is what we might call the impossibility objection. Critics argued that utilitarianism is completely impractical because it demands that we calculate the happiness of everyone affected by our actions before we make any decision. Imagine trying to decide whether to buy coffee from your local cafe or the chain store down the street, and having to factor in the happiness of the barista, the coffee farmers, the shareholders, the local economy, your own wallet, and every other person who might be remotely affected by your choice. You'd never leave the house. Mill's response to this is wonderfully practical and shows his deep understanding of how real human life works. He points out that we don't need to reinvent the wheel every time we make a moral decision. Humanity has been figuring out what promotes general happiness for thousands of years, and we've developed pretty good rules of thumb along the way. Don't lie, don't steal, keep your promises, help others when you can. These aren't arbitrary commandments handed down from on high. They're practical wisdom accumulated over generations of human experience about what tends to make life better for everyone. It's like having a GPS for moral navigation. You don't need to recalculate the entire route every time you make a turn. The basic directions have been figured out already. But when you encounter an unusual situation, when the normal rules seem to conflict or don't quite apply, that's when you might need to think more deeply about what would actually promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Mill also addresses what might be the most emotionally charged criticism of utilitarianism, that it's godless and undermines religious morality. In Mill's time, this was serious business, suggesting that morality could be grounded in human happiness rather than divine command was seen as dangerous radicalism. But Mill makes a fascinating counterargument that still resonates today. He suggests that if God is truly benevolent, then God's ultimate goal must be the happiness of creation. Therefore, a system of ethics based on promoting happiness is actually the most religious approach possible. It aligns human action with divine intention. It's a brilliant rhetorical move that transforms utilitarianism from a threat to religious belief into its fulfillment. But perhaps the most important misconception Mill addresses is the idea that utilitarianism demands too much of us, that it requires us to be saints constantly sacrificing our own happiness for others. Critics painted a picture of utilitarian followers as joyless martyrs, always calculating how they could suffer more to make others happy. Mill's response reveals his deep wisdom about human nature. He points out that the goal is the greatest happiness of the greatest number, not the greatest misery of the moral agent. A world where good people are constantly miserable wouldn't actually be a happier world overall. Moreover, Mill recognizes that sustainable moral behavior has to be, well, sustainable. People who burn themselves out trying to save the world don't actually save much of anything. As we wrap up this exploration of criticisms and misconceptions, what emerges is a picture of Mill as not just a philosopher, but as someone who understood that good ideas need to survive contact with real human beings living real human lives. His responses to critics aren't just intellectual exercises. They're practical wisdom about how to build a moral framework that actually works in the messy, complicated world we all inhabit. Picture this. You're scrolling through your phone, mindlessly watching TikTok videos for the third hour straight, when your friend texts asking if you want to go to poetry reading downtown. Your immediate reaction might be to decline. After all, you're getting pleasure from those short videos, right? But here's where John Stuart Mill would lean across our coffee table and ask you a fascinating question that cuts right to the heart of what makes life truly worth living. Mill wasn't content to simply say that pleasure is good and pain is bad. That would be far too simple for one of history's most nuanced thinkers. Instead, he dared to suggest something that might seem obvious to us today but was revolutionary in his time. Not all pleasures are created equal. Some pleasures, he argued, are inherently more valuable, more dignifying, more worthy of our pursuit than others. This wasn't just philosophical hair-splitting. This was Mill trying to rescue the entire utilitarian project from a criticism that threatened to destroy it. You see, critics of utilitarianism had been having a field day with what they saw as the theory's fundamental flaw. If the goal of life is simply to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, they argued, then humans are no better than pigs rolling in mud. After all, a pig seems perfectly content with simple physical pleasures: food, warmth, basic comfort. If pleasure is pleasure, then what's the difference between a human enjoying a symphony and a pig enjoying its slop? The critics smugly concluded that utilitarianism was a doctrine worthy only of swine. Mill's response was both elegant and profound. He essentially said, "You're absolutely right that there's a difference, but you're wrong about what that means for utilitarianism. The difference isn't that we should abandon the pursuit of pleasure. It's that we need to recognize that pleasures themselves come in different qualities, not just different quantities." Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever noticed how some experiences leave you feeling genuinely fulfilled, while others leave you feeling somehow empty despite being temporarily enjoyable? Mill would say you're experiencing the difference between what he called higher and lower pleasures. Lower pleasures are those we share with animals: the satisfaction of hunger, the warmth of sunshine, the relief of physical comfort. These aren't bad pleasures, mind you, but they're limited in their scope and depth. Higher pleasures, on the other hand, are those that engage our distinctly human capacities: our intellect, our aesthetic sensibilities, our moral imagination, our social nature. Reading a beautiful poem, solving a complex problem, having a deep conversation with a friend, creating something meaningful, or standing up for justice. These activities tap into what Mill saw as our higher faculties. But here's where Mill gets really interesting. He doesn't just assert that higher pleasures are better. He provides a test for determining which pleasures are higher. He argues that anyone who has experienced both types of pleasure and is capable of appreciating both will prefer the higher ones. It's what he famously captured in the phrase that has echoed through philosophy classrooms ever since. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Now, think about this in your own experience. Have you ever met someone who was genuinely educated, who had experienced both intellectual pursuits and simple physical pleasures, who then chose to spend their entire life pursuing only the most basic satisfactions? Mill's point is that once you've tasted the deeper wells of human experience, you can't really go back to being satisfied with just the shallow ones. Consider the difference between binge-watching a mindless reality show and reading a novel that challenges your worldview. Both might provide pleasure in the moment, but which one leaves you feeling more like your best self? Which one contributes to your growth as a person? Which one would you be proud to tell someone about a week later? Mill isn't saying the reality show is evil. He's saying that if we're trying to build a good life and a good society, we need to recognize that some pleasures contribute more to human flourishing than others. This insight has profound implications for how we live today. In our age of infinite digital distractions, Mill's distinction becomes almost urgent. We're surrounded by lower pleasures, the dopamine hit of social media likes, the easy entertainment of endless streaming content, the immediate gratification of online shopping. None of these are inherently wrong, but Mill would ask us, are you also cultivating your capacity for higher pleasures? The beauty of Mill's approach is that it doesn't require us to become ascetic monks, renouncing all simple pleasures. Instead, it asks us to develop what we might call a pleasure hierarchy in our own lives. Yes, enjoy that delicious meal, that comfortable bed, that funny video, but also make space for the kinds of experiences that engage your full humanity, learning something new, creating something beautiful, connecting deeply with others, contributing to something larger than yourself. Mill's distinction also helps us think more clearly about education and social policy. If higher pleasures are genuinely more valuable, then a society should be organized to help people develop their capacity to experience and appreciate these pleasures. This means education shouldn't just be about job training. It should be about developing our faculties for appreciation, critical thinking, and moral reasoning. But perhaps most importantly, Mill's insight about higher and lower pleasures gives us a framework for evaluating the choices we make every day. When you're deciding how to spend your evening, your weekend, or your life, you can ask yourself, which option will engage more of my human capacities? Which will contribute more to my growth and flourishing as a person? Which will I look back on with genuine satisfaction rather than empty regret? As we prepare to dive deeper into Mill's utilitarian philosophy, remember that this distinction between higher and lower pleasures isn't just an abstract philosophical concept. It's a practical tool for living a richer, more fulfilling life. Mill is essentially giving us permission to be pleasure seekers, while also challenging us to seek the kinds of pleasures that make us most fully human. Picture this. You're sitting in a courtroom, watching a judge deliberate over a difficult case. On one side, there's a clear violation of someone's rights. On the other side, punishing the offender might cause more overall harm than good to society. What should the judge do? Follow the strict letter of justice, or consider the greater good? This tension between justice and utility sits at the very heart of one of philosophy's most enduring debates, and it's exactly what John Stuart Mill wrestles with in perhaps the most challenging section of his work on utilitarianism. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, isn't this supposed to be simple? Don't we just do whatever creates the most happiness for the most people? Well, my friend, grab that coffee a little tighter, because Mill is about to show us that even the most elegant philosophical principles can get wonderfully complicated when they meet the messy reality of human justice. Mill begins this exploration by acknowledging something we've all felt at one time or another, that gut punch feeling when we witness injustice. Think about the last time you saw someone cut in line, or heard about a wealthy person getting away with something that would land an ordinary citizen in jail. That burning sensation in your chest, that's what Mill calls our sentiment of justice, and he argues it's one of the most powerful emotions humans possess. But here's where it gets interesting. Mill suggests that this feeling, as natural and important as it seems, might actually be rooted in utilitarian principles rather than standing in opposition to them. Consider how a child develops their sense of fairness. A 5-year-old doesn't have a sophisticated understanding of legal theory, but they know with absolute certainty when something isn't fair. "That's not fair" becomes one of their most frequently deployed phrases. Mill would argue that this instinct develops because fairness generally promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. When we share toys, take turns, and treat each other equally, everyone benefits. The child's sense of justice, even at that tender age, is actually a utilitarian calculation in disguise. But Mill isn't naive about the complexities here. He recognizes that our feelings about justice can sometimes lead us astray from the utilitarian path. Think about revenge, for instance. When someone wrongs us, our sense of justice might cry out for punishment, even when that punishment serves no useful purpose beyond satisfying our desire for retribution. Mill asks us to consider, is this really justice, or is it something else entirely? Here's where Mill's analysis becomes particularly brilliant. He argues that true justice must always serve utility, but utility doesn't always require what we might traditionally think of as justice. Imagine a scenario where a small lie could prevent enormous suffering, or where breaking a promise might save lives. Our immediate sense of justice rebels against these actions, but Mill suggests we need to look deeper at the consequences. Let me share a modern example that illustrates this beautifully. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many governments faced impossible choices about resource allocation. Should ventilators go to the youngest patients, the ones most likely to survive, or should they be distributed on a first-come, first-served basis? Traditional notions of fairness might suggest the latter, but utilitarian thinking focused on saving the most lives possible often pointed toward the former. These weren't academic debates happening in ivory towers. They were life-and-death decisions being made in hospitals around the world. Mill would argue that in such cases, the truly just action is the one that produces the best overall outcome, even if it violates our immediate sense of fairness. But notice how carefully he threads this needle. He's not saying we should abandon our concepts of rights, equality, or due process. Instead, he's suggesting that these concepts derive their moral weight from their tendency to promote human happiness and well-being. Think about property rights, for example. Why do we believe people should be able to own things? Mill would say it's not because ownership is some mystical inherent right, but because systems of property ownership generally lead to better outcomes for everyone. They encourage productivity, provide security, and create incentives for innovation. When property rights serve these purposes, they align with utilitarian principles. When they don't, we might need to reconsider them. This perspective has profound implications for how we think about modern issues. Consider the ongoing debates about wealth inequality. Some argue that extreme disparities violate principles of justice, while others contend that they're the natural result of fair market processes. Mill's framework suggests we should evaluate these systems not based on abstract principles of fairness, but on their actual consequences for human welfare. Do current economic arrangements maximize overall well-being, or do they sacrifice the happiness of many for the benefit of few? Mill also grapples with the tricky question of punishment. Why do we punish criminals? Is it because they deserve it in some cosmic sense, or because punishment serves useful social functions like deterrence and rehabilitation? Mill firmly places himself in the latter camp, arguing that punishment is only justified when it promotes the greater good. This doesn't mean he's soft on crime. Rather, he's asking us to think more carefully about what kinds of punishment actually work to create safer, happier societies. Now think about this. If justice is really about utility, how do we handle cases where the two seem to conflict? Mill's answer is both sophisticated and practical. He argues that in the long run, respecting principles like equality, fairness, and individual rights almost always serves utilitarian ends, even when it might seem costly in the short term. Why? Because societies that consistently violate these principles tend to become unstable, unproductive, and ultimately unhappy places to live. This brings us to perhaps Mill's most important insight in this section, that the relationship between justice and utility isn't a zero-sum game where we must choose one or the other. Instead, properly understood, they're complementary forces that work together to create flourishing human societies. Justice without concern for consequences can become rigid and harmful. Utility without respect for justice can become tyrannical and destructive. As we wrap up this exploration of justice and utility, Mill leaves us with a profound challenge: to think more carefully about the moral principles we hold dear, and to ask ourselves whether they truly serve the cause of human happiness and flourishing. It's a conversation that continues to shape our courts, our politics, and our personal relationships today, reminding us that the best philosophy isn't just about abstract thinking, but about creating better ways to live together in this complex, messy, beautiful world we share. Picture this. You're sitting in a courtroom, watching a judge wrestle with a difficult decision. On one side, there's a defendant who clearly broke the law but whose actions saved multiple lives. On the other side, there's the principle that laws must be upheld, that rights must be respected, regardless of consequences. This tension between doing what produces the best outcomes and respecting fundamental rights sits at the very heart of one of philosophy's most enduring debates, and it's exactly what Mill grapples with when he addresses how moral rights fit into his utilitarian framework. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, doesn't utilitarianism just say we should do whatever produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number? How do rights even factor into that equation? It's a brilliant question, and it gets to the core of what makes Mill's approach so sophisticated, and frankly, so much more nuanced than his critics often give him credit for. Mill understood something crucial that many of his contemporaries missed. Rights aren't just arbitrary rules that society dreamed up to make life complicated. They're actually some of our most powerful tools for maximizing human well-being over the long haul. Think about it this way. Imagine you're designing a society from scratch, and your goal is to create the maximum amount of happiness and flourishing for everyone involved. Would you create a world where people could lie, cheat, and steal whenever it might produce a momentary benefit? Of course not. You'd establish certain fundamental protections, certain lines that simply shouldn't be crossed, because you'd recognize that these boundaries create the stable foundation upon which genuine human flourishing can actually take place. This is where Mill's genius really shines through. He argues that moral rights derive their force not from some mystical source beyond human experience, but from their incredible utility in promoting human welfare. Take the right to property, for instance. Now, I'm not talking about the right of billionaires to accumulate endless wealth while others struggle. That's a different conversation entirely. I'm talking about the basic human right to own the fruits of your labor, to have some sphere of life that's genuinely yours. Mill would say this right exists because societies that protect it tend to be far more prosperous, innovative, and happy than societies that don't. Consider what happens in a world without property rights. Why would you work hard to improve your farm if someone could simply take it away tomorrow? Why would you invest time in creating something beautiful if you had no assurance you could enjoy it? The right to property, Mill argues, isn't just about protecting individual interests. It's about creating the conditions where human creativity and effort can flourish, ultimately benefiting everyone. But here's where it gets really interesting, and where Mill shows his sophistication as a thinker. He doesn't just say rights are useful, therefore they're absolute. Instead, He recognizes that rights can sometimes conflict with each other, and that even the most fundamental rights might occasionally need to yield to overwhelming utilitarian considerations. It's like having a well-designed building. The structural supports are incredibly important and shouldn't be tampered with lightly. But if the entire building is about to collapse, you might need to modify even the most crucial supports to save everyone inside. Let's bring this into the modern world with a concrete example. Think about privacy rights in the digital age. Most of us would agree that people have a fundamental right to privacy, to control who has access to their personal information. This right serves enormous utilitarian purposes. It protects human dignity, enables authentic relationships, prevents abuse of power, and creates space for individual development. But what happens when respecting privacy rights might prevent us from stopping a terrorist attack or tracking down a dangerous criminal? Mill's framework gives us a way to think through these dilemmas without abandoning either our commitment to rights or our concern for consequences. The right to privacy remains enormously important precisely because it serves human well-being so effectively. But in truly exceptional circumstances, where the stakes are extraordinarily high and the evidence is compelling, that right might need to be carefully and temporarily limited to prevent catastrophic harm. The key word here is carefully. Mill isn't giving us permission to trample on rights whenever it seems convenient. He's acknowledging that rights themselves exist to serve human flourishing, and that in the rare cases where respecting a right would dramatically undermine that very flourishing, we need to think deeply about how to balance competing moral demands. Consider how this plays out in something as everyday as promise-keeping. Mill would argue that we have a strong moral duty to keep our promises not because there's some cosmic rule written in the stars, but because societies where people generally keep their word are societies where trust flourishes, where cooperation becomes possible, where human relationships can develop and thrive. The utilitarian foundation doesn't make promise-keeping less important. It actually helps us understand why it's so crucial. But what if keeping a promise would lead to terrible consequences? What if you promise to meet a friend for coffee, but on your way there, you encounter a serious car accident where you're the only person who can help? Mill's framework doesn't leave you paralyzed by conflicting duties. Instead, it helps you recognize that the same concern for human welfare that normally makes promise-keeping so important might, in this exceptional case, require you to break your promise in service of a higher duty. This brings us to one of Mill's most profound insights about the relationship between individual rights and collective welfare. He understood that these aren't opposing forces locked in eternal conflict, but rather complementary aspects of a flourishing human society. Strong protection of individual rights creates the conditions where people can pursue happiness effectively, while attention to collective welfare ensures that the pursuit of individual happiness doesn't come at the expense of others' well-being. As we move forward in our exploration of Mill's thinking, we'll see how this sophisticated understanding of rights and duties shapes his approach to some of the most challenging questions in moral and political philosophy. The foundation he's laid here, seeing rights as powerful tools for promoting human flourishing, rather than arbitrary constraints on utilitarian thinking, will prove essential for understanding his broader vision of how we might create societies that are both free and genuinely committed to the welfare of all their members. Picture yourself sitting across from a close friend at your favorite coffee shop, steam rising from your mugs as you dive into one of those conversations that starts simple but quickly becomes profound. You've been exploring John Stuart Mill's revolutionary ideas about utilitarianism, and now comes the moment where theory meets reality. How do we actually live these principles? How do we apply the greatest happiness for the greatest number when the world presents us with messy, complicated choices that don't fit neatly into philosophical textbooks? Mill understood something crucial that many philosophers miss entirely. It's one thing to craft elegant theories in the comfort of your study, surrounded by leather-bound books and the luxury of abstract thought. It's quite another to make split-second decisions in a hospital emergency room, to craft public policy that affects millions, or to navigate the everyday moral dilemmas that life throws at us like curveballs. Mill knew that utilitarianism had to work in the real world, or it would be nothing more than an intellectual exercise. Now think about this. You're a doctor working in an understaffed emergency room during a crisis. Two patients arrive simultaneously. One is a young parent with 3 small children, suffering from injuries that require immediate attention but have a good chance of full recovery. The other is an elderly person with no family, facing the same medical emergency but with a much lower probability of survival. You have resources to properly treat only one. Traditional moral frameworks might leave you paralyzed, but utilitarian thinking provides a framework, albeit a challenging one. The greatest good for the greatest number suggests considering not just the immediate patients, but their families, their potential contributions to society, and the broader ripple effects of your decision. This isn't about reducing human beings to cold calculations. Mill was deeply aware of the emotional and spiritual dimensions of human experience. Instead, it's about acknowledging that when we're forced to choose, we need some way to think through the consequences systematically. It's about recognizing that doing nothing is itself a choice, and that choice has moral weight. Consider how this plays out in modern public policy. When governments decide how to allocate limited resources, they're essentially making utilitarian calculations every day. Should we spend $1 billion on a new highway that will save commuters 30 minutes daily, or invest that same money in early childhood education programs that might transform thousands of lives over decades? Mill's framework doesn't give us easy answers, but it gives us better questions. It asks us to look beyond immediate, visible effects to consider long-term consequences and hidden beneficiaries. Take the fascinating case of vaccination policies. During a pandemic, utilitarian thinking supports widespread vaccination mandates, even if some individuals suffer minor side effects or inconvenience. The calculation seems straightforward. The collective benefit of preventing widespread disease and death outweighs individual discomfort. But Mill's sophisticated understanding of liberty complicates this picture. He recognized that sometimes individual rights and collective welfare create genuine tensions that can't be easily resolved. Here's where Mill's genius really shines through. He didn't pretend these decisions were simple or that utilitarian math could solve every moral puzzle. Instead, he gave us tools for thinking more clearly about trade-offs we're already making, often unconsciously. Every time you choose to spend money on a luxury item instead of donating to charity, you're making a utilitarian calculation. Every time society decides to fund sports stadiums instead of homeless shelters, or to prioritize economic growth over environmental protection, utilitarian principles are lurking in the background. Think about criminal justice for a moment. Traditional retributive justice focuses on punishment fitting the crime, an eye for an eye, but utilitarian approaches ask different questions entirely. Does this punishment actually deter future crime? Does it rehabilitate the offender? Does it make society safer? Some of the most progressive criminal justice reforms of the past century have been fundamentally utilitarian in nature, focusing on outcomes rather than abstract notions of deserved punishment. Mill's insights become particularly powerful when we consider global challenges like climate change. Individual actions like recycling or driving less might feel meaningless in the face of such an enormous problem, but utilitarian thinking helps us see beyond individual gestures to systemic changes. If everyone in wealthy nations reduced their carbon footprint by even modest amounts, the cumulative effect could be transformative. The framework also helps us think about difficult questions of international justice. Should wealthy nations bear greater responsibility for addressing climate change, even if they're not the only contributors? because they have greater capacity to help, and their citizens have generally contributed more to the problem historically. The beauty of Mill's approach is that it scales from personal decisions to global policy. When you're deciding whether to tell a friend an uncomfortable truth about their relationship, you're weighing immediate pain against long-term well-being. When you're choosing a career, you might consider not just your own fulfillment and financial security, but also how your work contributes to society's broader flourishing. These aren't abstract philosophical exercises, they're the stuff of daily life. But Mill also understood the limitations of his own system. Utilitarian calculations require information we often don't have and predictive abilities we don't possess. How can we accurately weigh present costs against future benefits? How do we account for unintended consequences? How do we measure and compare different types of happiness and suffering? Mill's honest acknowledgement of these challenges makes his philosophy more trustworthy, not less. He wasn't selling a perfect system, but rather offering a framework for thinking more carefully about choices we have to make anyway. As we wrap up this exploration of utilitarian applications, notice how these ideas have quietly shaped the world around us. Cost-benefit analysis in business and government, public health policies, even the algorithms that determine what content you see on social media all reflect utilitarian logic. Mill's 19th-century insights continue to influence 21st-century decisions, often in ways we don't even recognize. The question isn't whether we should use utilitarian thinking, but whether we should use it more thoughtfully and deliberately, with full awareness of both its power and its limitations. Picture this. You're sitting with a friend who's just become a parent, and they're staring at their newborn with that mixture of wonder and terror that all new parents know so well. How do I raise a good person? They ask you. It's one of humanity's oldest questions, and it's exactly what John Stuart Mill grappled with when he considered the role of education in shaping our moral compass. As we settle deeper into our exploration of utilitarianism, we need to understand something crucial. Mill believed that the greatest happiness principle isn't just a nice philosophical idea floating in academic clouds. It's something that can be cultivated, nurtured, and grown through the right kind of education. Now, think about this for a moment. When Mill talks about education shaping moral perspectives, he's not just referring to what happens in classrooms. He's talking about the entire ecosystem of influences that mold a human being from cradle to grave. The way parents respond to a toddler's tantrum, the stories we tell children about heroes and villains, the examples set by teachers, the values embedded in our social institutions. All of these are educational forces that either nurture our capacity for considering others' happiness or diminish it. Mill understood something that modern neuroscience has confirmed. We're not born with fixed moral intuitions. Sure, we might have certain tendencies, but our ethical frameworks are largely constructed through experience and learning. He argued that if we want a society where people naturally consider the greatest good for the greatest number, we need to deliberately cultivate that mindset through education. It's like tending a garden. You can't just scatter seeds and hope for the best. You need to prepare the soil, provide the right conditions, and consistently nurture growth. Consider how this plays out in our daily lives. When a child sees their parent stop to help a stranger with a flat tire, even when they're running late, what lesson is being taught? When a teacher takes extra time to ensure every student understands a concept, not just the quick learners, what values are being modeled? These moments are educational in the deepest sense. They're shaping that child's understanding of what it means to care about others' well-being. Mill was particularly passionate about this because he'd experienced firsthand both the power and the limitations of education. His father, James Mill, had subjected him to an incredibly rigorous intellectual education from an early age. By age 3, John Stuart was learning Greek. By 8, he was reading Latin. This intensive schooling produced a brilliant mind, but Mill later reflected that it had also left him emotionally underdeveloped. He suffered what we might now call a nervous breakdown in his 20s. partly because his education had been so focused on intellectual achievement that it had neglected the cultivation of feeling and sympathy for others. This personal experience taught Mill that true moral education must engage both the mind and the heart. It's not enough to teach people logical principles about maximizing happiness. They need to feel connected to others' experiences. They need to develop what Mill called the social feelings of mankind. Think about the difference between knowing intellectually that poverty causes suffering and actually spending time with families struggling to make ends meet. The latter transforms abstract knowledge into genuine care. Mill argued that the current educational systems of his time, and we might say the same about many of ours, were failing to cultivate these social feelings. Instead of teaching young people to consider the broader consequences of their actions, education often focused narrowly on personal advancement and competition. Students learned to see others as rivals rather than fellow human beings whose happiness mattered equally to their own. But here's where Mill's vision becomes really interesting. He didn't just critique existing educational approaches. He offered a blueprint for transformation. He believed that education should systematically expose people to different perspectives and experiences. Students should read literature that helps them understand diverse ways of life. They should study history not just as a collection of dates and battles, but as a record of human struggles and triumphs that illuminate the consequences of different moral choices. Modern research in moral psychology supports Mill's insights remarkably well. Studies show that people who read literary fiction, for instance, score higher on tests of empathy and social understanding. When we follow a character through their moral dilemmas, we're essentially practicing the kind of perspective-taking that utilitarian ethics requires. We're learning to step outside our own immediate interests and consider how our actions affect others. Mill also recognized that formal education is just one piece of the puzzle. The broader culture serves as a continuous educational force throughout our lives. The stories our media tells, the behaviors our economic systems reward, the way our legal institutions balance individual rights against collective welfare, all of these shape our moral intuitions. If we want people to naturally think in utilitarian terms, we need these cultural forces to consistently reinforce the message that others' happiness matters as much as our own. This brings us to a crucial question for our own time. How well are our current educational and cultural systems preparing people to think about the greatest good? When social media algorithms are designed to maximize engagement rather than understanding, when economic incentives often reward short-term thinking over long-term collective welfare, when political discourse increasingly treats opposing viewpoints as enemies rather than fellow citizens deserving consideration, are we creating the conditions for utilitarian thinking to flourish? Mill would likely argue that we have both unprecedented opportunities and unprecedented challenges. Never before have we had such powerful tools for helping people understand diverse perspectives and see the global consequences of local actions. But never before have we also faced such sophisticated systems designed to capture attention and manipulate behavior for narrow interests. The path forward, Mill would suggest, lies in recognizing education as our most powerful tool for moral progress. Every parent teaching a child to consider others' feelings, every teacher helping students think critically about complex social issues, every storyteller crafting narratives that expand our circle of moral concern. These are the quiet revolutionaries building a more utilitarian world, one mind and heart at a time. As we prepare to explore Mill's thoughts on individual liberty and its relationship to collective happiness, we carry with us this fundamental insight. The society we want doesn't emerge automatically. It must be carefully and deliberately cultivated through education that shapes not just what we think, but how we feel about our fellow human beings. Picture this. You're sitting in a bustling coffee shop, watching the world go by through rain-streaked windows, and someone asks you a deceptively simple question. What makes society better? You might pause, coffee cup halfway to your lips, because suddenly you're grappling with one of the most profound questions humans have ever asked. This is exactly where John Stuart Mill found himself in the mid-1800s, and his answer would reshape how we think about progress itself. Mill wasn't just some ivory tower philosopher spinning abstract theories. He was living through one of the most transformative periods in human history. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping cities, democracy was spreading like wildfire, and age-old institutions were crumbling and rebuilding before people's eyes. In this whirlwind of change, Mill saw something revolutionary. Utilitarianism wasn't just a moral philosophy, it was a blueprint for human progress. Now, think about this for a moment. What if I told you that every major social reform of the past 2 centuries, from women's suffrage to civil rights, from public education to healthcare systems, can trace its intellectual DNA back to a simple utilitarian principle? That might sound like an overstatement, but stick with me, because Mill's insight about the imperative of progress is more relevant today than ever. Mill understood something that many of his contemporaries missed entirely. He realized that utilitarianism, the idea that we should act to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number, wasn't a static moral calculator. It was a dynamic force for change. Think of it like this: if you're constantly asking what produces the most good for the most people, you can't help but notice when your society falls short. You become, almost inevitably, a reformer. Consider how this played out in Mill's own life. He looked around Victorian England and saw women treated as property, workers laboring in dangerous conditions, and entire classes of people denied basic education. A more conservative moral framework might have said, "This is just how things are." But utilitarianism demanded a different question. Is this arrangement actually producing the greatest good? And when the answer was clearly no, Mill felt morally compelled to act. This is where Mill's genius really shines through. He recognized that true utilitarian thinking requires what we might call moral imagination, the ability to envision how things could be different. It's like being an architect of human flourishing. You don't just accept the blueprint you inherited, you ask whether there's a better way to build. Take the example of education, something Mill was passionate about. In his time, formal education was largely the privilege of wealthy men, but Mill applied utilitarian logic and asked, wouldn't society as a whole benefit enormously if everyone, including women and the working classes, had access to education? The math was simple. More educated people meant more innovation, better decision-making, reduced poverty, and increased happiness across society. Education wasn't just a nice ideal, it was a utilitarian imperative. Here's where it gets really interesting for us today. Mill's approach to progress wasn't about imposing change from above. It was about creating conditions where people could flourish and make their own choices. Think about how this applies to modern debates about technology, healthcare, or economic policy. Instead of asking, what do we traditionally do? Or what benefits me personally? Mill would have us ask, what arrangement allows the most people to live fulfilling lives? But Mill also understood something crucial that many modern reformers forget. Progress isn't just about changing laws or policies. It's about changing hearts and minds. He believed that utilitarian progress required what he called the cultivation of human faculties. In other words, you can't just create better institutions. You need better people to run them. This insight feels remarkably prescient when we look at contemporary challenges. Consider climate change, for instance. The utilitarian case for environmental protection is overwhelming. The greatest good for the greatest number clearly requires preserving a livable planet. But Mill would remind us that technical solutions alone aren't enough. We need people who can think beyond their immediate self-interest, who can weigh long-term consequences, who can empathize with future generations and distant communities. Mill also grasped something that modern progress movements sometimes miss: the importance of individual liberty in advancing collective welfare. This might seem paradoxical at first. How can focusing on individual freedom serve the greater good? But Mill saw that societies flourish when people are free to experiment, to innovate, to pursue their own vision of happiness within reasonable bounds. Think of it as a garden where diverse plants are allowed to grow. The whole ecosystem becomes more resilient and productive. This balance between individual liberty and collective welfare is perhaps Mill's greatest contribution to thinking about progress. He showed us that we don't have to choose between personal freedom and social responsibility. In fact, they reinforce each other. When people are free to develop their talents and pursue their passions, society benefits from their contributions. When society provides education, healthcare, and opportunity, individuals are better able to flourish. Now you might be wondering, how does this apply to the challenges we face today? Whether we're talking about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, space exploration, or social media's impact on democracy, Mill's utilitarian framework for progress offers a powerful lens. Instead of being paralyzed by complexity or tradition, we can ask, what arrangement of these new possibilities would produce the greatest good for the greatest number? What changes would allow more people to live fulfilling lives? The beauty of Mill's approach is that it's both idealistic and practical. It demands that we dream of better worlds while staying grounded in evidence about what actually works. It asks us to be both compassionate and rational, both visionary and realistic. As we finish our coffee and prepare to step back into our own rapidly changing world, Mill's message about the imperative of progress feels like both a challenge and an invitation. The challenge is to take responsibility for the trajectory of human civilization. The invitation is to believe that through careful thinking, moral imagination, and persistent effort, we really can make things better. And perhaps most importantly, Mill reminds us that this work of progress isn't optional. It's a moral imperative that flows directly from taking human happiness seriously. So here we are, settling into our final sip of coffee together, having journeyed through John Stuart Mill's remarkable exploration of utilitarian thought. You know, there's something almost magical about reaching the end of a profound book. It's like watching the final pieces of a complex puzzle click into place, revealing a picture that's both beautiful and surprisingly practical for our everyday lives. Mill's conclusion isn't just a polite farewell to his readers. It's more like a master craftsman stepping back from his workbench, showing us the tool he's carefully forged and saying, "Here, this can actually help you build something meaningful." And what a tool it is! This principle of the greatest happiness for the greatest number has proven to be one of the most enduring and influential ideas in human thought. Think about this for a moment. When Mill was writing these words in the 1860s, the world was a vastly different place. No smartphones, no global internet connecting us instantly, no climate change debates, no discussions about artificial intelligence ethics. Yet the fundamental questions he was grappling with, how do we make good decisions that benefit not just ourselves, but our communities and society as a whole? These questions feel more urgent today than ever before. Mill understood something profound about human nature that rings just as true now as it did then. He recognized that we're constantly making calculations, whether we realize it or not. Every time you decide whether to help a neighbor, vote for a particular candidate, choose how to spend your money, or even decide what career to pursue, you're weighing outcomes and consequences. Utilitarianism doesn't ask you to become some cold, calculating machine. Instead, it offers a framework for making those calculations more thoughtful, more inclusive, and ultimately more beneficial. Consider how utilitarian thinking has quietly shaped some of our most important modern institutions. When public health officials recommend vaccination programs, they're applying utilitarian logic, weighing the small risks to individuals against the enormous benefits to society. When city planners design public transportation systems, they're asking utilitarian questions about how to move the most people efficiently while improving quality of life for the greatest number. When tech companies, when they're at their best, design user interfaces, They're trying to create the greatest ease of use for the greatest number of users. Now you might be thinking, but wait, doesn't this lead to some uncomfortable conclusions? What about individual rights? What about justice for minorities? Mill himself wrestled with these very concerns, and his nuanced approach offers us something much more sophisticated than a simple ends justify the means philosophy. He understood that true utility, genuine human flourishing, requires protecting individual liberty, fostering diversity of thought, and ensuring that the pursuit of general happiness doesn't trample on fundamental human dignity. This is where Mill's genius really shines through. He saw that short-term utility calculations could sometimes conflict with long-term human well-being. It's like the difference between eating a donut for breakfast every day, because it makes you happy in the moment, versus developing healthy eating habits that contribute to your happiness and well-being over a lifetime. Mill argued that a society that protects individual rights, encourages open debate, and maintains strong institutions actually produces more utility in the long run than one that sacrifices these things for immediate gains. The enduring relevance of this thinking becomes crystal clear when we look at contemporary challenges. Take climate change, for instance. A utilitarian analysis asks us to weigh present convenience and economic interests against the well-being of future generations and the global community. It pushes us to think beyond our immediate circle, beyond our national borders, beyond even our own lifetimes. When Greta Thunberg challenges world leaders with the question, "How dare you?" she's essentially making a utilitarian argument that the happiness and well-being of millions of young people and future generations outweighs the short-term economic interests of powerful industries. Or consider the ongoing debates about artificial intelligence and automation. A utilitarian framework asks us to think carefully about how these technologies can be developed and implemented to maximize human flourishing, rather than simply maximizing profit for a few companies. It encourages us to consider the displaced workers, the potential for bias in algorithms, the concentration of power, and the long-term implications for human agency and dignity. Mill's utilitarian legacy also lives on in the growing movement toward effective altruism. Modern thinkers like Peter Singer have taken Mill's insights and applied them to questions about charitable giving, career choices, and global poverty. They ask penetrating questions. If you want to help the world, how can you do the most good with your resources? Should you become a doctor in an underserved community? Or would you create more utility by becoming a successful entrepreneur and donating large sums to effective charities? These aren't easy questions, but Mill's framework gives us tools to think through them systematically. What makes Mill's conclusion so powerful is his recognition that utilitarian thinking isn't just an abstract philosophical exercise. It's a practical approach to living that can make our personal lives richer and our communities stronger. When you're deciding how to respond to a difficult family situation, planning your career, or thinking about how to be a good citizen, utilitarian principles can help you see beyond immediate emotions and self-interest to consider the broader web of consequences that flow from your choices. As we close this book together, Mill leaves us with both a challenge and a gift. The challenge is to think more carefully, more inclusively, and more long-term about our decisions. The gift is a framework that has proven remarkably durable and adaptable across cultures and centuries. Whether you fully embrace utilitarian philosophy or simply carry forward some of its insights, you now have tools for making decisions that can contribute to human flourishing in ways both large and small. Mill's utilitarian legacy reminds us that philosophy at its best isn't about winning debates in ivory towers. It's about living better, more thoughtful lives and creating communities where human beings can truly flourish. And in our interconnected, complex modern world, that mission feels more important than ever before. John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism presents a compelling case for the principle of utility, arguing that actions are right if they tend to promote happiness and wrong if they tend to produce the opposite of happiness. Mill expands on the ideas of previous utilitarian thinkers, discussing how the greatest happiness principle can provide a foundation for ethical decision-making. Here are some key takeaways from the book. 1. Maximize happiness, minimize pain. Mill's core message is that we should strive to enhance happiness and reduce suffering in our actions. To apply this practically, start by considering the consequences of your decisions. How will they affect your well-being and that of others? Begin incredibly small by reflecting on daily choices and their impacts, and slowly expand this mindset to bigger decisions. 2. Quality over quantity ***. Mill distinguishes between higher, intellectual, and lower bodily pleasures. Start by prioritizing activities that enhance your life in meaningful ways, such as reading or learning something new. Be patient with yourself as you explore what truly fulfills you beyond immediate gratification. 3. Consider the collective well-being ***. Mill emphasizes the balance between individual interests and the greater good. Apply this by considering how your actions contribute to the broader community. Engage in discussions or volunteer in areas that align with this principle, and observe the ripple effect of your contributions. For the role of justice ***. Mill argues that justice is a critical component of utilitarian ethics, as it supports the overall happiness of society. Start small by advocating for fairness in your sphere of influence, whether at work, home, or in social settings. Recognize the importance of standing up for what is right, trusting that your actions contribute to a just society. 5. Continuous self-improvement ***. Mill's philosophy invites us to reflect regularly on our moral framework and strive for personal growth. Begin by setting aside time for self-reflection and goal setting. Remember that progress is a journey, and every small step towards becoming a better version of yourself matters. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with at least one idea from this book that stuck with you, one concept you're going to carry forward. It could be something that challenged your thinking, something you want to try, or even something you disagreed with. Your insight might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. And if this summary gave you something valuable, a new perspective, a spark of motivation, or even just a peaceful hour with your coffee, share it with someone who might need it too. Subscribe to One Book, One Coffee, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new summary. Every week, we sit down together with one great book, one warm cup of coffee, and the simple belief that wisdom, shared well, can change lives. Until next time, keep reading, keep growing, and remember, every small step counts. See you at the next book.